Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Welcome to the Urbanism Hour. Before we start, I just want to share with you a couple of housekeeping rules. Please note that the session is recorded and the video will be later on available on the Academy's YouTube channel. So if you don't want to be recorded, please keep your cameras turned off. During the session, you are more than welcome to add your questions and comments in the chat box. The chair for today will gonna go through the chat box and then you will be invited to join the discussion at the end. So keep the questions coming. We wish to thank our sponsors, to say a big thank you. Without their help, we wouldn't be able to organize all these online activities, and we are grateful for their support. And finally, if you want to get further involved with the Academy to learn more how you can become a member and what are the activities that you can get involved and support the AOU mission, you are more than welcome to visit our website and learn more information. So now I will hand it over to Jane Dann, Director of Tibbalds, to introduce us to our session and to introduce our speakers. Jane, over to you and welcome to today's session.
Good afternoon, everyone. Very pleased to see so many people have joined us today. I'd like to thank you all for giving up your lunch time and coming along to what I think is going to be a really interesting and topical session today on the National Model Design Code, which was published in draft by the government at the beginning of this month, together with guidance notes for design codes and some proposed amendments to the National Planning Policy Framework. As Olga said, the session is going to follow the usual pattern for these events. We've got two speakers who are each going to speak for around 10 to 15 minutes. If you have questions, please type them into the chat box and we'll pick them out and I'll come back to you at the end to ask you to ask your question yourself. And we should have around 30 minutes for questions and discussion. And we've got two fantastic speakers who need very little introduction from me. Our first speaker, I think, is Andy von Bradsky, who I'm delighted to have here. He's head of architecture at MHCLG, and he's been leading the very welcome programme that's been reinvigorating the government's planning practice guidance on design, and has commissioned and very actively collaborated on both the National Design Guide and the National Model Design Code. And our second speaker is David Rudlin, who, again, I'm sure will be familiar to most of you. He's here today in his role as director of URBED rather than as director of the Academy. And he's led the URBED team that's prepared the National Model Design Code and guidance notes for design coding that we're going to hear about today. So thank you for coming, and over to you, Andy and David.
Thank you very much, Jane, and very good afternoon to everybody. Thank you very much for coming. It's good to be amongst friends, and that hasn't always been the case in recent times, but it's great to be here to be giving this presentation. David and I have done this a few times now, so we're quite well versed. We're going to give you a run through the code from a government perspective, and I'll come back onto the presentation after David's given a fuller explanation of the coding work that he's been working on. And I'll come back and talk about some of the piloting work that we're doing. So it's a bit of a sandwich of us working together. So just from the government perspective, you'll know 30th of January, we announced a whole series of aspects of design. Firstly, the response to the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission, which was a formal response a year after the report had been published. And it picked up a number of points in response by amending the National Planning Policy Framework to emphasise design, creating the National Model Design Code, announcing an Office of Place and the pilots programme. And I'll touch on each of those as I go through. I think it's important to note the amendments to the NPPF that reflect design quality and beauty, making placemaking, I suppose, a strategic objective of the planning system, emphasising that. A real emphasis now on producing design codes and guides, and really a few other aspects to the NPPF that have been changed. For instance, introducing the concept of street trees wherever practical and wherever possible. So a big package really of announcements on work that I've been working on for the last year. Next slide. So this is these are the documents that have been issued. Firstly, a National Model Design Code, which we'll talk about, and in addition, the design guidance notes that go along with that. Next. Sorry. I have to say, a fantastic collaboration with URBED and with Tibbalds on all of the products that we've now produced in government. It has been very iterative. We've talked very much across government departments. We've involved stakeholders right across the sector. And so this is almost like a co-production as opposed to something that we've just simply outsourced and expected external consultants to deliver. We had quite a considerable amount of overview and response to the consultation. Design Council helped with that. We talked internally with PINS, with DEFRA, with DFT, BAYS, DFE, and the Home Office, so real engagement with other government departments. And we also, as a consequence of that, talked to Natural England, Historic England, and the Highways Engineering organisations. So some real interactions there. Next slide. So this is the suite of documents that now exists, and I think that's quite important to emphasise that this is not just about the National Model Design Code, although that's clearly a very important set of documents. It's about how all these documents read together. The work that Jane did on the National Design Guide is an anchor for the code and for the guidance notes. And I'll come on to talk about that in a bit more detail. But it is now quite a significant suite of documents that can be referred to in planning decision making. Next slide. Just going back on that point about interactions with other government departments, we took the opportunity here to try and embrace all of the guidance that is emerging or is being worked on or is out there to make sure that the guidance notes pick up on relevant government initiatives. You will know that Manual for Streets is being updated, Commission for WSP, and they're currently working on that. I'm sure many of the members will be engaged in some of the workshops. I'd urge you to engage with that particular piece of work. The Environment Bill and all the implications to that becomes quite a steer on the guidance notes, and green infrastructure standards, which I think will emerge in the months ahead, has also been incorporated in our thinking. And of course, climate change as far as we are able to go, and even to the extent of putting in a reference to modern methods of construction and how coding can actually help support that particular initiative. Next slide. So what is the code all about? We don't need to dwell too long on this because you will know very well how design guides and how design codes differ, and you'll know how design codes can be used. And there's a whole raft of learning from overseas that we've gone through in deciding how to adapt that learning to our own circumstances. I mean, effectively, the National Model Design Code and the guidance notes are a toolkit for local planning authorities, specifically aimed at local planning authorities in this case, because we know the private sector are very familiar with their way of using codes, but this is for local planning authorities to set out their own codes in their local area. So it's about how local design codes can be produced and embedded in the current planning system, either as SPDs or other statutory documents. Sets out methods about how you capture the views of local community right from the outset. And that's a key plank of the approach to coding, is how do you get local people involved in plan making to a greater degree than currently. It's all about how you apply good urban design principles to help inform planning decisions. And again, you won't need any instruction from me about what good urban design is all about. Next slide. The great thing about what we've done with the code is that we've built on the work of the National Design Guide and taken the 10 characteristics that we set out in that document, which fundamentally are the ingredients for well-designed places. We believe that all these 10 characteristics need to be considered in some way, shape or form. And it's the foundation, the principles, if you like. So you need to read that particular document to understand why the code is structured the way it is. It needs to be applied locally. So although we've titled it National Model Design Code, it is not a code, it is a process for how you adapt those 10 principles to local conditions. Next slide. And going back to the point about community engagement, a really important aspect from a government point of view is how do we, what we call bring democracy forward, which is a bit of a catchphrase at the moment, but is a genuine attempt to get community engagement up front in local decision making on what is included in plans. So the guidance notes include reference to the techniques for that, some obviously well tried and tested approaches to running workshops, charrettes and so on, but increasingly, especially in the current age and the current conditions, how that's applied in digital through social media, visualization techniques and so on. And we hope for much greater innovation in that particular regard in the years ahead. So one of the key challenges for all of this is how do we measure support for design codes that then get embedded in the planning system. So it's not all the answers aren't all there. We need to test that, and I'll come back to the piloting at the end to sort of demonstrate that we are listening to how more community engagement might actually influence and shape local design codes. Next. And just finally from me, and segueing into what David will talk about, the document isn't a code, as I mentioned, it is a process. It needs to be applied flexibly according to local circumstances, and it needs to be informed by local vision, local understanding of the context in which you're operating. It could be ambitiously at county level, it could be ambitiously at local authority level, and we'll talk about area. I know David will talk about area types in particular, and that sort of is an ambitious approach to trying to apply coding in a much wider way, and moving away from just applying it to development sites, which of course developers know how to do. We do anticipate that local authorities will have to work closely and collaboratively with developers in developing their codes. So it's what can we learn, what can they learn from landowners, developers who've been doing this a long time, and how do we make sure that coding is deliverable and viable for an area. So a collaborative approach is probably going to be necessary to achieve this. Next. And over to you, Dave.
Thank you, Andy. I actually just wanted to point out from the two slides back, but you'll notice a slightly younger version of me there with the tenants of Old Trafford. And this was only just before I became chair of the academy. So you can see what being chair of the academy does to you in terms of aging. Anyway, I want to just take you briefly through the process that's in the code. The guidance notes are far too big to really do credit to in the time we got available, but the process actually is the thing that's innovative about the coding that we've done. It's in 3 broad steps, which are broken down into 7 sub-steps. And I'm just going to use my time to just take you through those steps and how we see local authorities and how they're likely to undertake the coding process. So step 1 is analysis. And the first part of that is a decision about the coverage of the code. As Andy said, local authorities may wish codes to cover their entire area. That's certainly not a requirement. It may well be that they just decide to have codes for their new sites, the allocations. It may well be that they want it to cover both new sites and some parts of their area. I suspect it'll be focusing on areas where change is likely. So the first question is how much of your district you wish the code to cover. The second question is what subject matter you wish it to cover. We expect most codes will cover movement, nature, built form, identity, public space and use. There are other issues that we talk about in the code, particularly things like homes and buildings, quality standards, sustainability and management, which may not be in your code. Doesn't mean they're not important. It may well be that they are included elsewhere in your policy agenda and not necessarily within the code. So deciding on what it covers. The other part of stage 1A is, as Andy said, working out your consultation strategy. And importantly, potentially doing training for community groups so that they sorry, so that you actually introduce community groups to the process of coding so they know what to expect and how they can get involved. The next part of the analysis program, stage 1B, is looking at the analysis of the wider area. This is most authorities can do this from their existing GIS systems, but things like the street hierarchy are crucial, as I'll come back to in a moment, in terms of how the code applies, but also where the schools are, the public transport, the open spaces, and so on. We then move on to the vision, and as Andy said, the key thing that we've introduced in this process is what we call an area type. Elsewhere it might be called a character area or a typology. Area type was the term that we derived upon, which is unique to this particular document. Now these are areas of relatively homogeneous character, but the point about the area type and the design vision for it is that we're not so interested in what the character of it is now. We're more interested in the character as we wish it to be in the future. So, for example, if you've got a suburban area that your local plan is seeking to intensify, the code would reflect that intensification. It would reflect the parameters of the area once it has been intensified. And the area types, therefore, are used to derive a set of guidance and rules, which then are area specific in terms of how they're applied. To do that, clearly you need to define on a plan which areas are covered by each area type. And this is what we do through a coding plan. And you can see on the left-hand side of that slide, we include 10 suggested area types. These are by no means exclusive. They're just an indication of the sort of types that you might include. So you've got city centre in there, you've got 2 types of suburban area type, you've got an urban neighbourhood one, and you may have rural and village ones depending upon the area that you're covering. The coding plan, as you'll see on the right, also includes the white areas with dotted lines around them, and these are the development allocations within the local plan. We've been criticised in other forums for the code not giving any guidance about where these sites should be allocated. The answer to which is that's not the job of this code. That is the job of the local plan to allocate sites, and this code then takes off at the point at which the site has been allocated. Now, in order to code for these sites, you need to have a framework on which to hang the code. So stage 2C is the master planning stage. So for each of these development sites, there will need to be a framework master plan, which at the very least shows the high streets and secondary streets, local centres, open space, and the area types. This is something which may be done by the landowner or the developer. That's perfectly fine, and then would be adopted by the local authority. It may be done in partnership, or it may be done by the local authority on sites where there isn't an active plan being developed. But clearly you need a plan which allows you then to apply the code to the sites. So we can come to step 3, which is the code itself. And this is in 2 parts. The first part are the elements that apply to the area types. And so about half of the code in total varies by area type. So things like building line, building height, active frontage, and so on. These are things which differ for different area types. In the guidance, we use 3 examples, again, not intended to be exclusive, the town centre, the urban neighbourhood, and the suburb. And we show in the guidance how the rules and the guidance may differ by those area types. So this is a typical page. You've got a paragraph at the top which summarises the issue. In the middle, you've then got a set of suggested policies that you might include in your code, each with a reference in blue, which refers to the guidance notes. And at the bottom, you've then got 3 illustrations showing town centre, urban neighbourhood, and suburb, and how you may apply those. Each has got a drawing, and we're also, you're thinking that local codes may just use these drawings if they wish to do as well. And then there is a summary drawing, which then shows what happens when you pull all those issues together. So that's how the thing is structured. We have a section on identity. It's something which is being keenly anticipated in certain parts of the built environment profession, to see how we've dealt with the issue of architectural character and design. We've done this in such a way that it's architecturally neutral. It doesn't indicate contemporary or traditional architecture at all. It's just about the principles of good building design, and working closely with Andy, we've tried to make this of the basic design principles of buildings which could apply to any type of architecture, and we do that for smaller buildings, but also for tall buildings as well. So again, one of the issues we had with the code was not being able to be very specific on policies, because we're dealing with the whole country, and clearly there's huge variation in local circumstances. But we did want to put some examples of the way that coding would be specific. So these are some examples of specific coding. So, figures for the density, for the floor area ratio, for the way that you code for party walls. The hope is that in local codes, this guidance would be clear, unambiguous, and with yes/no answers. Have you applied the code or have you not, rather than value-laden subjective judgments. The code also includes quite a lot of work on streets. We were again very aware that Manual for Streets was about to be prepared when we were doing this. It's now in preparation, and so we don't trespass hugely in terms of the highway engineering parts of this, but of course streets are about much more than highways. They're also to do with the buildings that enclose them, the way those buildings relate to the streets. And we have a whole series of these sections in the code showing different types of street and how they may relate to the character of the area. So this then comes into 2 matrices, which are crucial and will be crucial, I think, to each local code. One, which is the matrices of high streets. And so this is a matrix which shows the high streets, the street types, sorry, down the left-hand side, and the area types across the top. So clearly a high street in a town centre is going to be very different to a high street in a suburb. And the second matrix, which we haven't filled in because it would need a huge amount of local information to do so, is to show all the policies that apply by area type and all the area types across the top. And so you can go down, find your area type that your site is in, read it down, and it will tell you which each policy and how it applies to your sites. That, as I say, then has code-wide guidance. There's some things like the principle of the separation of public and private space, which is not specific to an area type, it applies to everywhere. Likewise with things like sustainability. So this final part of the code then talks about the areas which are applicable across all area types. The guidance, as I say, sorry, this is an example of that code-wide guidance. The guidance notes then backs up that. So each of the sections in the code relating back to the Urban Design Guide that Jane produced shows more detailed information on each of those issues, and it looks a bit like this. Again, the brief was to make it as visual as possible with as few words as possible, which is something I struggled with, as Andy will tell you. The first version was twice the length of the one that's been published, but to make it simple and accessible and again, as precise as we can be. So we have a 10 area type, 10 sections in the guidance notes, which again, look a lot like this. So with that, I'm going to hand back to Andy to talk about the piloting program.
Thank you, David. And can you move on? Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So the first point to make is that the NPPF and the code are out for consultation until the end of March, as I mentioned before. So do get your comments in. I'm expecting that there will be comments on the code. I think we've got a very comprehensive package, but there might be comments on the way what we've designed or what we put together applies in different circumstances. So we're aware that there will be real differences of how this is applied, say in a central urban location, compared to how it might be applied in a county with a rural settlements. So we've decided to run some pilots. We're calling it a testing program because we don't necessarily expect to see a final design code out of it, but we do want to test what we've done in certain conditions. We've had a very healthy response to that. If I'm in any way coming across as being a bit tired, it's because I'm wading through lots and lots of applications, and we have to decide on 10 that will go forward to test that. We'll be doing that over the next couple of weeks, making an announcement, and then over a 6-month period testing the coding work in different contexts. That will be followed up by a revised coding document following the consultation, which will then go out for a further 10 pilots later this year, probably sometime in spring, when we will then be seeking proper local design coding outcomes applied in specific circumstances. The idea is to have a suite of documents that then can inform how design codes can be applied in different conditions. So that's where we're at the moment. We're expecting some learning, obviously, for the reformed planning system, but I have to emphasize the fact that the application of design coding is at the moment for the current planning system, and that's an important distinction. Back to you, Jane.
Okay, thank you very much, Andy and David. That was great, and I think it gives us a really clear introduction to the approach and the content of the National Model Design Code. We've got several questions in the chat, but I'd just like to start with one. And I think we're very familiar with the use of design coding as a tool to secure design quality on large sites or where there's significant scale of change. And there's quite a lot of evidence to show their benefits. And I think one of the key things that this code does is actually extend the potential of that into existing areas where the change may be smaller scale and maybe less predictable. And I'm just wondering, because David, you did refer to thinking in the presentation about it possibly being mostly larger scale change. Do you envisage it being used for existing areas where there isn't that large scale of change proposed?
Yes, and I'm sorry if I left that impression. I think I was talking about you'd be applying it to areas where change was expected, such as intensification, but that change would probably be made up of quite small interventions. And so I think that the code, I do see very much applying to existing urban areas, and that then applying to all scales of development within those areas. And I think that's how they work elsewhere. I mean, one of the things, as Andy said, we did was look at other systems, and a particularly interesting presentation from Catherine Firth on the Boston code that she's just produced in the US. And yeah, it applies to existing areas very much. And so householders have a very clear idea about what rules apply to them, as well as large developers.
Okay, do you want to add anything to that, Andy?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good challenge. Coding is used for large-scale phased development very often. How can coding be used for infill or more incremental types of development within an existing urban setting? I think there's a challenge there, and I think our piloting is intended to draw that out as to whether that is a good use of coding. And you know, if we need to have so many codes in a single area, then you know, is that an appropriate way of setting parameters for the planning system in a local area? So it's to be tested, I think.
Okay, thank you. We had a question from Shane Clark about sort of vision and end states. Shane, do you want to ask your question? Are you there? Maybe I'll ask it before you. The character as we wish it to be suggests an end state. How to accommodate change over time? If you'd like to start on that one.
I think that's another challenge back. I mean, even in the private sector, codes change in accordance with social, economic, environmental change. And we are in a period of quite a lot of change in so many ways. And your work on the National Design Guide brings that out. The looking forward sections actually demonstrate just how much change is going to arise. And that was before the pandemic, and the impact that might have on built form and behaviour and social impact. So I think firstly, the code work that we're doing needs to be kept under review. So we need to make sure that we're keeping abreast of policy changes and also changes in technology, changes in society, so that the actual model code, I think, needs to be kept up to date. And one of the key things for me is once we have a coding in a planning system, how do we make sure that that doesn't get frozen in time and that we do keep on top of that? And then the final bit of the jigsaw is, even when you do have a code for a development, do we need to sort of think about the flexibility for how that code is kept up to date with economic circumstances and changes and so forth. So it is something we need to keep on top of.
I agree with all that, and it's a lovely philosophical question for planners about whether there's ever an end state. I mean, I would say that it's useful to have a target, even if you know you're never going to hit it, or a destination, even if you know it's never going to arrive. You know what you're heading for, but don't expect to ever get there.
Okay, thank you. There's a question from Stephen B that's also related about kind of objectives of codes, intensification. Stephen, are you there? Do you want to ask your question?
Yes, yeah, thank you. I mean, I think one of the difficulties that local authorities have and will continue to have in engaging with local people is addressing the implications of intensification. And David was pointing out that this is largely an assumption in all the work that we are doing, how to accommodate more development in existing urban areas, and that's controversial locally, and I think it would be helpful if there was more specific guidance in the code as to how density should be determined locally to help inform that the challenge of the different perspectives on intensification between local planning authorities and local communities.
I don't disagree. I mean, Stephen, are there ways in which you think that could be done? I mean, let's be constructive about it.
Well, I don't think this is the right opportunity for me to put forward methods of doing it. I just rather hope that the code would provide some guidance. It's very structured in everything that it presents, but it doesn't seem to offer specific guidance on how density should be calculated in specific locations. The examples that David's worked up give assumptions of densities for particular different types of urban location, but how local communities should determine and acknowledge and accept those densities are particularly challenging. I can't really see a solution off the top.
Yeah, I didn't mean to put you on the spot. I mean, I think there is an issue around this in a sort of broader sense, in that we need to make the most of our brownfield sites. We need more urban intensification. We need to, maximize the opportunities, really. And very often those sort of decisions are the very ones that communities react against. And so how do we deal with that is something that just needs to be dealt with through a sort of engagement process. And we need to persuade communities and bring them along with us on the basis of what the benefits might be for them for that intensification. So it's very much engagement aspect, isn't it? How do we engage positively and demonstrate the positive benefits of intensification?
Yeah, but that persuasion ought to be informed by some structured approach that provides local planning authorities with a consistent approach, which will gain credibility with local communities and still be consistent with national guidance. Good points.
Mm-hmm. I think the issue of density is an interesting one, because in most design codes that I'm familiar with, there's a sort of avoidance of talking about densities and really trying to move on to it being form-based codes and talking about the physical form of the place rather than densities in terms of numbers. But clearly in the National Model Design Code, density has quite an important role, and I wonder if you'd like to just explain a bit more about why that is.
I mean, I think density is an important measure. If you look at other codes elsewhere in the world, floor area ratio is a very central part of what codes do. We don't tend to use that in this country, although we did include floor area ratio within this code because it is a way of particularly measuring non-residential densities. In the UK, we do density by homes per hectare, which of course excludes commercial space. So there is guidance in the code about how to measure both types of density, although Steve's probably right that it applies more to new development than to existing. There is also a section on intensification in the use section, looking at ways in which that might be allowed. But yeah, I take the point that we may not have entirely looked at how you would measure the density of existing urban development, because if you're going to say that the area type has a range of densities, you obviously need to know how dense it is now and whether it falls short of that target or not.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Ulrika Kern about timeframes and lifespans of codes. Would you like to ask it?
Oh, sorry, yes, I haven't read this entire code. I was just not really sure whether it's intended to last for a few decades at least, because I think it seems such a big project. If you actually want to see it to fruition, you have to make sure that it doesn't get overhauled in 3 or 4 years' time by some other new idea on how to plan locally. It needs a long-term consistency. And is there any insurance about that, especially if you want to put all that work into it in the first place?
Well, David might be better placed in answering some of that, but I mean, my view is that you need to sort of relate the coding work in some way to your local plan duration and make some kind of a link between the two. So I mean, the intention of a design code is that it becomes effectively your addendum to your local plan, and it's what you intend to do over a plan period. I'm not a planner, so I can't give you the ins and outs of the planning aspects to that, but a 5-year duration and then extended out would seem to be sensible.
And I think that's the right answer within our current planning system because of the way that we have review and so on of the local plan. I'm just going to add to that. The one example we came across was interesting in South Africa. where the code that is available on the council's website is the current code, and it's a live document, and it will actually be updated. So people will apply to change their area type, or zoning as they call it, and then if the application's approved, the code on the website changes, and that becomes the new code. So it's actually a constantly updating document in South Africa. And whilst I'm not suggesting that in this country, because we have a different system, I think we're right that we do need a process to keep it live and to keep it relevant.
I think that's a very interesting point about timescale, and I know the focus is on the National Model Design Code in the current planning system, but when local authorities prepare design guides, they're often looking for a document or something that'll last them 5 to 10 years, because it's quite a big investment. And I'm just wondering how you see it dovetailing with the proposals for planning reform, and particularly with the sort of classification of renewal, growth and protect in relation to the area types in what might be quite a relatively short time going forward.
Yeah, I'm specifically not going to be talking about the reform in this discussion, because there's an awful lot of work going on elsewhere in government about that, which has to take its course. We have sort of introduced this National Model Design Code as a sort of a forerunner, if you like, to what might be in planning reform, but it's a long way to go before we know what that planning reform might be, and I'm not really able to discuss that in this forum.
And I'm working on under the same restrictions as Andy on this one, I'm afraid. So,
okay, I mean that's quite understandable, but I think it's clearly going to be something that people are going to be having to think about as they come forward with proposals. So it's going to be very much in the forefront of a lot of people's minds.
I think it's fair to say, and a simple a statement, that the planning white paper in its entirety is unlikely to materialise exactly as it's set out. It's got to go through a lot of iterations, a lot of discussions, a lot of internal discussion, a lot of engagement and stakeholder engagement with other parties before we know exactly what that reform will be.
Okay, thank you. James Gross has a question about the use of area types. Would you like to just explain it, please?
David, go for it.
go on, James, you're muted.
Still muted.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah. I suppose. All right then, Jane. I mean, I wasn't really if I was given my choice of the two questions I asked, that wasn't really the one I'd prefer to ask. But I would prefer to ask the question about proportion. But I'll ask this one first. So, the question was about areas and zoning, and I think it's sort of it's tied up with that same question around sort of future intensification. But my concern would be is if the local authority ends up adopting an area-based code for a particular area, and then you use that classification of the 10 different area types, is that it becomes problematic in terms of introducing a more varied mixed-use approach to development around change of use, around flexible frontages, street types, etc. If people consider we're not part of the district centre, we're part of the suburbs, and yet we'd actually like to see some of those suburbs becoming in themselves far more rich and varied places to live as well, and allowing intensification. And it's just, is that effectively understood by the local authority as a collaborative code author, that this does still affect and allow for change?
Yeah, they're area types rather than zones, and clearly area types are not use specific. I mean, very much not, in fact. And so you're likely to have mixed use area types. But also, if you've got a mono use area type at the moment and you wish it to be mixed use, then the rules would reflect that. The rules would allow you, encourage you indeed, to mix more uses up into those areas. And so the area types are a tool for getting that diversity into these areas.
So would you see an area type requiring a mixed use then?
Yes, you could do.
I mean, a code would be a requirement rather than an encouragement, presumably.
Yeah, indeed, yeah.
So it might actually explicitly require that of each development. That's interesting. Okay. James, I do have your other question. Do you want to ask that one?
Yeah, if you don't mind, that's very kind of you,
That's
Jane.
fine.
So, I don't know if any of you follow, there's a very good Twitter feed called, I'll paraphrase, it's SH1T Planning. I don't know if have you seen that at all. But the thing that he often puts up there, and I don't know if that's on the call, is it's usually to do with architectural proportion, dreadful fenestration, hideous roof pitches, alignment of windows in fenestration particularly. I did note that, and I do understand David's point that it's a difficult thing to put in and around identity, but when we've done coding, when I was at the Printers Foundation, for example, we were always very, and of course there was a slight philosophy behind that as well, around sort of golden curves, Euclidean geometry, etc. But the notion around human proportion, alignment in elevations, etc. I just feel that it's a pity not to talk about proportion and that I can see there are references, but a little bit more, just to iron out some of those really quite ugly things that come through it and are allowed through the planning system, because there's no tool currently available actually to say, no, this is wrong or this is ugly, etc. And it's just a sort of plea to say, can that be sort of revisited as when the next iteration of this comes out?
I think we struck the right balance on that, in my view, that if you start being quite deterministic about what the right proportion should be, you cut across what is appropriate for an area. You also might constrain the innovation and the ability to go creatively within a framework. So what we didn't want to do was create a design code that actually stipulated how buildings should look. And we really felt very strongly about that. And that was endorsed by stakeholders that we engaged with. I think we talk about proportion, we talk about the window to wall ratio, we talk about some very specific issues. I think the one thing I would say about the coding work is that you must maintain engagement with design review panels. You must maintain engagement with experts in an area, community engagement panels or design panels, because the coding work in itself is a framework and you still have to design properly within that framework.
I would accept that point, that answer. I haven't got a difficulty with that. I think it's more about then requiring rationales to support the application of proportion, etc., within elevations, not exclusively within elevations. And if the coding could be perhaps a little bit firmer on requiring that would be a way that answers your question, but doesn't allow some of the sort of dross to get through at the same time.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. It's a good point, James.
Okay, thank you. Pam Alexander's got a question about community engagement and trust. Would you like to ask your question, Pam?
Thanks. Well, if I may, in the same spirit as you gave to James, I would like to just comment on the last point, because I think it is possible for local planning committees to apply the sort of parameters that Andy and James have just been talking about via the quality review panel and also by independent experts on the planning committee. We do it all the time at LLDC. And we find the quality review panel makes enormous improvements in schemes before we see them. So I do think it's possible, but there's nothing wrong with anything that supports the ability to look at good proportion. I hate the word ugly as much as I hate the word beautiful. My question was, how can we build the trust that we need for real broad community engagement and not just the people who are already involved? If it is, and frankly, it has to be, by anticipation of complete reform of the rules before we're likely to have built out the schemes, or possibly even before we've given them planning approval, by those doing the consulting. And meanwhile, local people see permitted development rights making things happen which they may not like and can't affect. And I absolutely respect your position, Andy, and indeed, obviously, David's as a consultant to you, that you're not responsible for this, but can you help us with what thought's been given to how we support those who have such limited resources anyway to apply to the quality of design in planning systems?
So I think there's some real challenges in terms of how we build that community engagement in the real planning system. We do it on projects, and really good architects, really good consultants that operate in this space David's practice being one of them. I worked with him on the Hume estate. So if you go back to some of that real pioneering regeneration work, you know, engagement was a key aspect of it. You couldn't actually get anything through without doing that properly. So the challenge is, how do you mainstream that, and how do you do that realistically within the resources of what's available? And I think there are some real challenges with that. I don't think local authorities have got all the tools in the box, or all the resources that they need to up that game. I think we do need to test that out again to find out what innovations are out there in terms of engagement. And there are some local authorities are doing some really interesting things with digital engagement and digital platforms, and how communities can engage very proactively in a more creative way without necessarily going to planning meetings on a cold Thursday evening to be sold something by a developer who only wants to get it over the line. I think the issue for me is what skills are needed in a local authority, and what does the tech sector have to offer in terms of making it more realistic, engagement more realistic, and again capturing some of that innovation that might be happening in the sector.
But if I may, Andy knows, I'm well aware of all the opportunities for innovation, and I think we've leapt a decade on digital engagement in the last 11 months. That doesn't really answer the question about how we build trust in a system, which is a long-term local plan, for example, and a long-term design code for at least the next 5 to 10 years, when people don't like what they see happening today. And I think that's a real issue for all of us involved in community engagement.
I mean, it is a fundamental issue, isn't it, that when people get to see the actual scheme, you can't then say, well, actually, the opportunity to comment on the principles behind this scheme was 3 years ago when we agreed the code. And that is the fundamental problem with quite a lot of planning, actually. I've just been doing a series of sessions with residents in Manchester with Sophie King from Sheffield University, and it's the same with a local plan. They object to the scale of development in their area, but that was decided 5 years ago when the local plan was agreed. So that is always the problem, to actually get people to understand when you're discussing these things that it will have real relevance, and it may not be for a few years, but it actually will become very important.
My point was about PDR though, not about timetables.
You know, Andy and I can't really talk about PDR, unfortunately, although I have done, as you'll know, on other occasions. The other thing, actually, I just wanted to say, I've been in conversation over the last week with a parish council doing a neighbourhood plan, and they were saying they got hold of the model code, and they're saying, this is great, it's really clear. All this professional sort of smokescreen that's been raised by developers and the council, both saying the same words but meaning completely different things. This is really clear because it actually talks about practical stuff that we can measure on a plan rather than just quality and aspiration. And so hopefully I think the code is actually relatively straightforward for a community to get to grips with, rather than sort of in slightly sort of less clear-cut terms, which is what a lot of planners talk in.
I can say one thing, Pam, about the PDR aspect is that government has made moves to acknowledge the importance of standards in agreeing for permitted development right. Effectively, permitted development right is government giving grant of permission. So what are the standards that need to go along with that grant of permission? And they have made the first step along that route with space standards, lighting in conversions. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous that you're faced with that kind of requirement to be imposed. And our local authorities using the prior approval for design effectively. And so I think that there needs to be this sort of building up of the expectation that standards are built into PDR.
Exactly.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you. Mark Newman had a question about the urban environment and pandemics. Do you want to just ask that?
Hi, yeah, thank you. So yeah, really in relation to the current situation, and has that affected your thinking in any way? And further to that, especially in building upwards, there's some research done showing that the further off the ground you get, the more unsatisfied you were with the lockdown. So be interested to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Well, with building upwards, I'm not sure what to say about that. That's not something I can comment on, I suppose. I mean, learning from the pandemic. Excuse me a minute. I'll just learning from the pandemic is something that is happening, and we did think about these issues as we were developing the guidance notes. So the emphasis on green infrastructure standards and access to amenity and space, green space, nature, the importance of that. The issue around standards of space within a home. We have a section within the guidance notes which emphasizes what good design looks like in terms of internal of homes. Now, you might not think that that's a coding issue, but we wanted to embrace as much as we could in that guidance document that covers standards and what might be expected in standards. I think in answer to your sort of more direct question about learning from the pandemic, I think we're all going to be evolving our thinking around urban form, about built form. Developers will be rethinking about, what sells in the market. There will be a gradual understanding, I suppose, of how development might happen in the future. I think our guidance notes are a good step in that direction.
But if you were looking for a government policy on, preventing tall buildings, then it wasn't our position to do that. We weren't in a position to make policy. We are reflecting policy on the whole, and so we're simply telling local authorities what they're able to do. And of course, they may wish to prevent tall buildings, but that wasn't the position that we could take in the code at all.
Okay, we're coming close to the end now. I think David Lamb, you've got a question about a neighbourhood forum. We've got a time for a short question and short answer.
Yes, hopefully. Can you hear me okay?
We can.
Yeah. I think David's alluded a couple of times to the answer to my question, which is at the level of neighbourhood plan forum discussion with real people. And I'm in the business of citizen engagement. I just wanted to ask the question, am I on the right footing getting a copy of this code and starting to apply it at that level to an existing settlement that has big problems but not big development prospects because it's been here a long time and is very dense in an urban neighbourhood?
We would very much hope that you can do that, and we'd be very much interested in hearing the results when you try and do so.
Yeah, if I'm still alive. Yeah, okay. Is it available to all good bookshops?
It's available online. There's not many there aren't many physical copies of it, but it's all downloadable. Okay,
it's just that I'm dealing with a sort of nature of a group of 7 who are unfortunately of a similar age to me, who are not very into the modern methods of communication. And so I've got to sell it to them apart from the neighbourhood if we advance on this. So yeah, so it's available online basically.
Yeah, it's on gov.uk and
yeah.
Available to everybody that way.
Is it worth using it as a test bed, or is it too light for you?
No, I mean, just in terms of its relationship with neighbourhood planning, we're very conscious that there is this sort of already this planning system which is really closely engaging communities in design processes. So in a sense, design coding is sort of writ large from that very successful programme. So I think how local authorities support neighbourhood planning through this is a continuing interest, and how the coding work can support what you do is very much of interest. And in fact, that's one of the key things that we're looking to test in the pilots is how does this relate to neighbourhood planning processes?
Well, I'm going to use it. if I accept the invitation to help them, I'm going to use it as a piece of work to analyse how you apply code to the neighbourhood plan system.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think we're pretty much out of time now, so I'm going to finish here. I'd just like to thank Olga and Stephen for setting up the webinar and running it, and thank everyone for attending. I hope you found it interesting and informative. I certainly have. And most of all, I'd just like to thank our speakers, Anima Bradsky and David Rudlin, for an excellent job. Very grateful to that. So I'll leave it here and wish you all a good weekend.